It's no secret that everyone in Hollywood wants some of that MCU magic. Every movie franchise since 2012 has dreamed of building large, interconnected, and most importantly, insanely profitable cinematic universes. But so far, almost all of them have crashed and burned. The DCEU is being wiped clean for a new start, almost every new Star Wars project has been met with apathy, and even the MCU itself seems to be in turmoil. The novelty of cinematic universes seems to be wearing thin. Aside from the big ones, a few smaller cinematic universes have cropped up in the past decade. The Conjuring universe, Godzilla's Monsterverse, and Sony's Spider-Man universe, formerly known as the Sony Pictures universe of Marvel characters, also known as Spunk. But perhaps my favorite example of this was Universal's Dark Universe, which I like to lovingly refer to as the Dark Universe Cinematic Universe, or the Dooku. The Dark Universe was an ill-fated cinematic universe based on reboots of classic Universal monster characters: Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, etc. The original movies from the 30s and 40s were actually kinda like the first cinematic universe, with crossovers and Easter eggs and such, so I guess it kind of makes sense for Universal to dig up their corpses in pursuit of the cinematic universe bag. Like I said, the Dark Universe wasn't the first time that these monsters were brought together in one franchise. The original Universal Monsters franchise had an initial run of 41 movies from 1931 to 1956. Dracula and Frankenstein, the first films of the franchise, were first released in 1931. While I referred to the franchise as a cinematic universe, that title is a bit misleading, especially in the early years. While all the movies have since been brought under the same Universal Monsters franchise umbrella, the movies were largely disconnected from each other. 41 films were released during this 25-year period. Kind of. Two of the films, Island of Lost Souls and The Monster and the Girl, were produced and created by Paramount, but the rights to the films were later bought by Universal and they were packaged together with the other films in a collection in 1991. Additionally, not all of these films were really Universal monster movies. Again, they were all packaged together in the 1991 collection, but if we really boil it down, there were only about 31 core Universal Monsters movies. The other 10 often fit in thematically, but they don't have the same recognizable creatures as the others. Films like The Raven or Man-Made Monster fit the same horror vibes of the other movies and were included in the 1991 collection, but they don't really count as Universal monsters. Finally, there is a Spanish version of Dracula, also released in 1931, that was essentially just a retelling of the English version, just with Spanish-speaking actors, so really we have 31 movies in total. The franchise had a strong start for the first 5 years. Starting in 1931, the studio released Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, Bride of Frankenstein, Werewolf of London, and finally Dracula's Daughter in 1936. However, by this time the studio was having financial troubles and was eventually sold. The new owners introduced a new Universal picture, and with audiences in general beginning to turn away from horror movies, the studio tried to pivot. The recent films, Dracula's Daughter in particular, came up against censorship from the newly formed Production Code Administration and required the film to go through several rewrites. Not wanting to fight the PCA, the new owners of Universal put all horror movies on hold. However, this all changed with the incredibly successful triple feature of Dracula, Frankenstein, and Son of Kong at the Los Angeles Regina Theater, with the 600+ seat theater being sold out for 5 weeks straight. This was basically the Barbenheimer of their time, and if they had Twitter back then, they definitely would have been making Son of Dracustein memes. After expanding the specifically Dracula and Frankenstein double feature to more theaters across the country, the new owners of Universal finally saw how lucrative the Universal monsters could be. The success of the double feature led to a second era of the monsters, starting with 1939's Son of Frankenstein. From 1939 to 1946, the studio again saw consistent releases, with at least one Universal Monsters film being released a year. These releases include Son of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man Returns, The Mummy's Hand, The Invisible Woman, The Wolfman, The Ghost of Frankenstein, Invisible Agent, and The Mummy's Tomb. For our purposes, the most important film released during this time period was 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. In case the title isn't clear, this is the first direct crossover between characters in the film, officially creating a shared universe, at least between these two films. Previous films had Easter eggs to other monsters, but none had confirmed crossovers like this. The film had to stretch the timelines a bit. The original Wolfman was set in then present day, but this film is set in the 1800s like the other Frankenstein films, but nobody was really paying attention to that. Writers hadn't really invented time travel or the multiverse as plot mechanics yet, so just don't think about it too hard. Long story short, this one is more Civil War than The Avengers, with the Wolfman and the monster being more foe than friend. A more accurate title for the film would be Frankenstein Beats the Wolfman, but the Wolfman gets some good licks in too. Further films of this era include Phantom of the Opera, Son of Dracula, The Invisible Man's Revenge, The Mummy's Ghost, House of Frankenstein, The Mummy's Curse, House of Dracula, and She-Wolf of London. Most important for our purposes again are House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, who follow the same monster-mashing conventions of Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. The former, released in 1944, combines the characters of the Wolfman, Dracula, and Frankenstein's monster, and also apparently just the concept of Mad Doctor and Hunchback are iconic enough to be included as monsters. Dracula and Frankenwolf never meet each other, with Dracula being killed off before reintroducing the other monsters. So it's less of sort of a bigger crossover and more of a, hey look, Dracula's in this one. Oh, and all of the monsters die in this one. There are no more monsters, until 1945's House of Dracula, which revives all the monsters. How, you may ask? I don't know. They don't say. Dracula and the Wolfman are just good now. They died, but they got over it. This film sees Dracula and the Wolfman seeking out a doctor to cure them of their respective afflictions. Dracula gets killed again, but the Wolfman is eventually cured. Also, Frankenstein's monster is revived at the very end, just to be immediately killed again. In 1946, Universal again faced money problems, and they dropped most of the remaining iconic actors from their roster. With no money and little demand, Universal Monsters productions were put on hold. For the second time, the Age of Monsters had come to a sputtering end. 6 films were spat out in the next decade. 3 of them were Abbott and Costello films, comedies in which the duo would meet different monsters, including Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, and the Mummy. These don't really count as Universal monster films, but they kind of do, and since Abbott and Costello both exist, then I guess the Invisible Man and the Mummy connects to Frankenstein, which connects to the Wolfman, which also connects to Dracula. I'm really stretching for the connections here. Please, you just gotta go with me on this. Surprisingly, the Creature from the Black Lagoon was the latest and final Universal monster added to the lineup, with his initial film not releasing until 1954, a full 23 years from the first Dracula film. 3 Creature of the Black Lagoon films were produced, with the final releasing in 1956. And with that, the Universal Monsters franchise was finished. The franchise sat dormant for years, occasionally being re-released in limited runs at theaters in an attempt to recreate the Dracustein magic, but none quite met the mark. Universal Monsters fell into relative obscurity until being repackaged for home releases in the 90s. The home release was incredibly successful and brought the monsters back to the cultural forefront. The iron was hot and the studio was ready to strike. We can't talk about the state of the Universal Monsters in the 90s without first mentioning The Mummy. Directed by Stephen Sommers and starring Brendan Fraser, this remake of the original The Mummy is more action-adventure than horror, and it fucking worked. The movie was huge and spawned 2 sequels, a shit ton of Scorpion King prequel spin-offs, and even an animated show. Hot off the success of the first 2 films, Sommers' next project was an attempt to revive other monsters from the franchise. Enter the Van Helsing-verse. Starring Hugh Jackman, 2004's Van Helsing saw the character facing off against Dracula, wolf people, and various other monsters, including Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, who, fun fact, was never formally part of the Universal Monsters franchise. The whole thing with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was actually a later addition. The movie wasn't good. Although the film technically made a profit, it was critically panned. A sequel and TV spin-off based in Transylvania were planned, but production on the sequel stopped and the show's pilot was never picked up. The film did receive an animated short film prequel, but that was the final act of this universe. Even though it was written and directed by the same man as The Mummy, the films seemingly had no connection to one another, at least at the time. Who knows, maybe if Van Helsing had been a bigger success, the Mummy films and Van Helsing might have had a bigger crossover. The next step is more of a hypothetical than an actual attempt, but it's still worth mentioning. Enter the Del Toro-verse. Guillermo del Toro was apparently offered control of the Universal Monsters franchise around 2007 and was even looking to reboot Creature from the Black Lagoon, which later became The Shape of Water. He declined the offer, but the slate allegedly would have included films like The Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Wolfman, and a Van Helsing reboot. Del Toro is currently preparing to direct a Frankenstein film for Netflix, but it will have no connection to any previous Universal films. Next, we turn turn to network television for the Dracuverse. Dracula originally aired on NBC in 2013. Originally pitched as a one-season limited series, the studio was so confident in the project that it was officially upgraded to a full-blown series. After airing, the show was almost immediately canceled. The show starred Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as the titular Dracula, who was revived from the dead after being killed centuries before. He tries to get revenge on the Order that had killed him originally, and also gets wrapped up in this whole mystery of a woman who seems to be the reincarnation of his dead wife. He also meets a man named Van Helsing who had secretly revived Dracula for his own ends. The show had a Wolfman spin-off in the works, but with the cancellation of Dracula, it was never picked up. I would imagine that this universe could have been similar to the CW's Arrowverse, using a multitude of shows to showcase all the monsters they had to offer. Aside from Dracula and the Wolfman, I could easily imagine shows based off of Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, or even just a Van Helsing spin-off. But this universe, like all the ones before, never came to pass. With the Dracuverse out, it was time to move on to bigger and bolder worlds. The Dracuverse Untold. Dracula Untold was a 2014 film starring Luke Evans as Vlad Dracula, or Dracula. Dracula was the Prince of Transylvania and served as a soldier in the Ottoman Empire, where he killed thousands of people horrifically, but now he feels bad about it, so he's fine. He lives in peace as the ruler of Transylvania, but soon learns that the Ottomans are likely planning an invasion. Meanwhile, his entire crew is slaughtered by a creature in a cave, which is of course a vampire. Turns out this vampire is like the vampire and was actually the Roman Emperor Caligula centuries before. Also, he's played by Charles fucking Dance. Later, Dracula returns to the cave after more signs of a coming invasion, and Caligula gives him 3 days of vampire powers. But if he drinks any human blood, he's a vampire forever. Long story short, Dracula destroys the invaders, but becomes a vampire permanently in the process. Dracula is assumed dead after a final confrontation, but oops, he actually survived. Cutting to present-day London, Dracula encounters a woman who looks exactly like his dead wife, just like in the Dracuverse. From afar, Caligula shows up and says,
"Let the games begin,"
hinting that the story is just beginning. Ooh, ah. This, of course, was the end of the Dracuverse Untold, as it was immediately thrown in the trash to make room for the new top dog in the cinematic universe hierarchy of power, the Dark Universe. Which, like, can we talk about how fucking stupid the name Dark Universe is? How is that supposed to convey anything? The Marvel Cinematic Universe is a cinematic universe with Marvel characters. The DC Extended Universe is about DC characters. What the fuck does dark mean? The name is probably just to distance themselves from Godzilla/King Kong's similarly poorly named Monsterverse. They wanted something distinct from that, but the Dark Universe is like, it's nothing. That's not a thing. That's nothing. On May 22nd, 2017, Universal made an official announcement about their new cinematic universe. Being helmed by Alex Kurtzman and Chris Morgan as the twisted, dark reflection of Disney's Kevin Feige, the Dark Universe was to be an expansive, multimedia cinematic franchise exploring the dark and twisted world of gods and monsters. Kurtzman had written the first 2 Transformers films, the first 2 Star Trek movie reboots, and Amazing Spider-Man 2, while Morgan had written every Fast and Furious after Tokyo Drift, excluding 9 for some reason. He also created the 2009 Nickelodeon show The Troop, which is a show I think I'm the only one that remembers. The announcement was coupled with an official logo, a theme by Danny Elfman, and a cast photo of the leads of the slated films. We have Sofia Boutella as the Mummy, Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll/Mr. Hyde, Javier Bardem as Frankenstein's monster, Johnny Depp as the Invisible Man, and Tom Cruise as everyone's favorite classic monster, Nick Morton. It was later revealed that nobody in this image was in the same room at the same time together, and they were all just photoshopped, making my inclusion to the photo lore friendly. The Dark Universe would officially kick off with 2017's The Mummy, a troubled reboot of the 1999 film The Mummy, which itself is a beloved reboot of the 1932 film The Mummy. The film stars Tom Cruise as Nick Morton, a soldier who accidentally unearths a tomb of an ancient Egyptian princess who comes to life and wreaks havoc. The Mummy's production began in 2012 as The Mummy 4, a sequel to the previous Brendan Fraser films. However, the plans were scrapped for a darker reboot of the franchise. The reboot went through a few directors before landing on Andy "The Flash" Muschietti, who was pulled in to direct more of a horror film than an adventurous one. However, these plans changed again, and the film was reworked to be more family-friendly, and Andy almost immediately left. Alex Kurtzman was pulled in as director, and this is when the whole Dark Universe project really began, as Chris Morgan was also brought on to coordinate this whole cinematic universe. Tom Cruise was also added to the project around 2015, and The Mummy and the Dark Universe as a whole officially began construction. Over the course of production, Tom Cruise would take over more and more creative control of large portions of the film to the point of almost being a director himself. This caused rifts between the crew, with some thinking that he was improving a flawed film, while others saw it as overreach. I wouldn't say that this is the reason The Mummy turned out so bad, but it is a sign that production on the film and the universe wasn't going as smoothly as Universal Pictures had hoped. But a final film was eventually created, and it was at the very least a passable film. However, leading up to the release, the marketing for the film was not a good sign. One of the first trailers was released in December of 2016, and its absolutely disastrous launch was a harbinger of things to come. Somehow they released a trailer without the movie or sound effects for the first half of it, so it only left in these awkward grunts and screams from everyone's favorite cultist, Tom Cruise.
And Pan, this is November 4-0-9er-9er.
What the hell?
I've watched this clip 100 times. It's so fucking funny. Instead of leaning into the mistake, the studio immediately DMCA'd every copy of the trailer and tried to remove it permanently from YouTube, which is a move that the film industry refers to as a bitch move. 2 weeks after the Dark Universe announcement, The Mummy was finally released, and oh boy was it bad. The movie begins by revealing the Dark Universe logo and theme, a move that I'm sure in an alternate universe we would celebrate as much as the Marvel logo. We get an immediate exposition dump about an ancient Egyptian princess who was next in line to the throne until a son was born. So she calls upon the god of death to give her evil powers to get her revenge by going all evil, and also by putting the god of death into a mortal body for some reason that isn't ever really explained. The design of Set, the god of death, was honestly one of the best parts of this movie. It's super spooky, but like, it only shows up for 5 seconds and then you never see it again. In present day, we're introduced to treasure hunting soldier Nick Morton, played by Tom Cruise, and his goofy sidekick Chris Vale, played by Nick from New Girl. They're hunting a treasure in Iraq, but the town they need to go to is filled with insurgents, so Nick from New Girl immediately requests for them to commit a war crime. Tom Cruise follows this up with an even more incredible line, saying that they aren't looters, they are liberators of precious antiquities. What the fuck? And the movie doesn't condemn this. Like, Tom Cruise says that they are liberators of precious antiquities, and the rest of the film supports this claim because supposedly the insurgents are like destroying artifacts or whatever. So actually, by stealing from this country, Tom Cruise's character is actually in the right. Long story short, they immediately get into a gunfight with the locals, and whoop whoop, the town gets hit by an airstrike. So whatever. And again, so far, the movie has painted all of their actions as justified, but like, they're the invaders here. Anyway, the airstrike unearths a big giant tomb where they buried the mummy demon earlier, and after diving into the hole, Tom Cruise, Nick from New Girl, and some sort of archaeologist named Ginny find the sarcophagus of a mummy. Tom Cruise gets Zendaya Dune visions, and the sarcophagus is taken out of the cave. Back at the base now, a giant sandstorm is coming in real quick, so they load up the cargo plane and take off right as the storm hits. On the plane, Nick from New Girl starts getting real sick and his eyes go white and ooh, spooky, while Tom Cruise starts having more of the Dune visions of the mummy. Turns out Nick from New Girl is possessed and kills the guy in charge and cuts the rope to release the mummy. Tom Cruise shoots and kills him, and the airplane immediately starts to smoke, and a flock of birds crash through the windshield, killing the pilots and causing the plane to go into free fall. Tom Cruise gives a parachute to Ginny, but then he dies in the crash. R.I.P. Except he doesn't. He wakes up in a morgue, obviously, because we are 20 minutes into the lead movie where Tom Cruise is like the starring role. We cut to the plane crash site, and the mummy has escaped and kisses a few people to death before reviving them into zombie servants. And again, this is honestly one of the best scenes of the movie because the mummy is genuinely spooky and its movements are like real uncanny and like gross. If this movie had just leaned into the horror instead of resisting it at every turn, it really could have been good. Ghost Nick from New Girl keeps showing up and haunting Tom Cruise and and telling him that they're both cursed. And then Tom Cruise starts seeing these rats and mummies and stuff and almost gets hit by a car. And then he screams, and the scream is like an edited version of that one scream from the fucked up trailer. Cruise and Ginny go to find the sarcophagus so that Tom Cruise can see that the mummy is just a dead corpse and that these visions are just visions. And she isn't. She's alive, and he gets captured. There's almost a mummy sex scene, but Ginny shows up and they fight the mummy and run away. The mummy catches them during their escape, but she's captured by this mysterious organization. Ooh, I wonder if this is a setup for the rest of the movies. Tom Cruise is taken to the headquarters of Prodigium, a secret monster hunting organization. And on their way in, they pass like a bunch of artifacts that not so subtly hint at other creatures, like a vampire skull and an arm from the creature from the Black Lagoon. Tom Cruise then meets the leader of this organization, Dr. Jekyll, played by Russell Crowe. The movie slows to a crawl so that Dr. Jekyll can set up the whole universe, telling us all about the monsters and the organization, and wow, this section really does not age well. Dr. Jekyll starts going into hide mode for a second before taking a shot and going back to normal. So the whole deal of the Prodigium is to find and contain and destroy different monsters, but it takes like 20 minutes to set that up. Also, we find out that the mummy chose Tom Cruise to become the vessel for Set, the god of death, and is trying to put that god into his mortal body. So the basis for this whole movie relies on this dagger with a stone in it that was broken. The dagger and the stone were hidden by crusaders in the 12th century. The dagger was hidden in just like a random statue that Tom Cruise accidentally broke open, and the stone was stored in a tomb that was being unearthed by a subway tunneling project. The Prodigium now has the dagger, and it turns out that, the Prodigium are planning on stabbing Tom Cruise and turn him into the vessel so that they can destroy him and Set forever. They don't really explain how they're going to do that, because if they put the god of death into the mortal body, then it's like, okay, but now Tom Cruise is inhabited by a god, so how do you kill that? Whatever. Tom Cruise steals Jekyll's normal pills, and he gets locked in a room with him as he transforms into Hyde. Also, side note, but Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde have different fingerprints because his hand doesn't work on the handprint scanner anymore, which is really funny because, like, how did they get Hyde's hand to scan, right? Like, the machine recognizes that it is specifically Hyde, so they had to get him into the system somehow, but he goes into, like, Hulk mode, so did they, like, knock him out and use his hand when he's knocked out, or do they somehow convince him to go along with this whole fingerprint scanning business? Like, what was happening there? Hyde offers to make a deal with Tom Cruise, essentially saying like, if you turn evil, we can take over the world, and he obviously declines, but meanwhile the mummy escapes after possessing a dude with a spider. The mummy steals the dagger and starts causing destruction and stuff, and everyone starts heading for the subway tunnel thing to get the stone for the ritual. The corpses of the Crusaders come to life, and they look pretty cool. That's all I have to say about this section. Tom Cruise gets stuck in a flooded tunnel and has to save Ginny from drowning / being killed by swimming zombies, but he gets captured and taken to the mummy in the process. Also, Ginny just dies. She drowns. GG, it's over, RIP. Tom Cruise breaks up with the mummy, stealing the dagger and almost breaking the stone, which, like, if the stone can be shattered this easily, why didn't the Crusaders just do this earlier? Like, just with one hit, it seems to be splintering, so, like, if their intention was to prevent bad things from happening, and that's why they hid the pieces of the dagger, like, why not just destroy it? There's nothing that says you can't just break the stone, and they didn't want to use it because they kept it separated and like gave it to a dead dude to be locked away forever, so why didn't they just destroy it? Anyway, Tom Cruise ends up stabbing himself with a dagger at the last second and becomes the god of death. I don't know why he does that. All of a sudden he's just like, I'm never gonna work for you. Boop. Boop. He goes all possessed by the god of death, but seeing Ginny's dead body somehow reminds him that he's award-winning actor Tom Cruise, so he takes back control and kills the mummy. And he's just like a superhero now. He has like super strength, and then he kisses her to death. Tom Cruise, now being like half god of death, brings Ginny back to life, but he's all creepy and mysterious now. Tom Cruise, god of death, runs away just as Dr. Jekyll shows up, and later we cut to Tom Cruise and Nick from New Girl wandering the desert together to find answers, I guess. He doesn't really say. He just says that, where's your sense of adventure? And then starts riding towards the pyramids of Giza. So I'm not sure where they're going, but perhaps there's a mobile game that will give us an answer. All in all, the movie is like technically competent. The CGI is pretty solid, especially with the mummy and the mummy zombies, but this wasn't about the mummy. It was about Tom Cruise's Nick Morton, who then becomes a superhero with the powers of a mummy. Like, by the end, he's literally just like Moon Knight from Marvel. Like, he just has the power of an Egyptian god, and sometimes it like wants him to do stuff that he doesn't want to do, and that's it, but like he's just a superhero. Ultimately, one of the worst sins of the film is just that the stakes are set way too high for a world and a character that we're not invested in. The immediate stakes of this film and this franchise are the complete destruction of the world, but like the audience doesn't care enough for it to matter. If you compare that to the stakes of the first Iron Man film, if Tony Stark loses, sure, he'll die, his company will be taken over, and the weapons manufacturing will continue, but the world will see another day. The stakes of the film come not from what happens to the world, but from the audience's investment into Tony Stark, and a lot of that comes from just how dang charismatic he is. The most likable character in this film dies like 15 minutes in, so there's no reason to be invested in him. There's just no audience buy-in, and I think that's ultimately the reason why this movie flopped. If you're expecting us to care about the film and this universe, then don't make it seem like you're gonna destroy it in the first go. Overall, I'd say this film would earn a solid C on the tier list. And with that, we finished our review of every Dark Universe film currently released. The film grossed $410 million on a $125 to $190 million budget. With marketing and other costs, the film actually lost the studio $60 to $100 million. Things were off to a bad start. In October, Universal stopped pre-production on Bride of Frankenstein, the would-be second film of the franchise. By November, both Chris Morgan and Alex Kurtzman had left the project, and the newly renovated monster-themed office building sat empty. And with that, the Dark Universe was officially finished. Okay, kind of. In 2020, The Invisible Man, a reboot of 1933's The Invisible Man, was released. And it sort of was part of the Dark Universe. At the very least, the Dark Universe wiki page lists it as being part of the franchise, but the same wiki also literally has a quote from the director saying it isn't part of the universe. I'm gonna go ahead and make a call that it isn't, even though The Invisible Man was in the original cast photo. See, there he is. The final movie of the Dark Universe is Renfield, released in April of this year. It's a horror comedy about Dracula's familiar Renfield, and nope, I'm just gonna go ahead and make a call that this is absolutely not part of the Dark Universe. If the Dark Universe's official Dracula is Nick Cage, I give up. I give up. It's so Jover. It's so Jover. But the Dark Universe wiki page says it's the third installment, so yeah, fuck it. Give Renfield a B. I didn't watch it. And while we're talking about the wiki, can I just say how fucking crazy this wiki is? Like, there's one official canon movie, and this wiki has 584 pages. Guys, you got one movie. What is there to write about? For reference, the Conjuring Universe Wiki, a franchise that has 9 total actual films, only has 234 pages. Who the fuck are the Dark Universe superfans? What are you doing with your lives? Why have you made 584 pages? Aside from The Mummy, there was a slate of films said to be in production with the announcement of the Dark Universe. The most well-documented of which was the aforementioned Bride of Frankenstein, which was said to star Angelina Jolie as the titular bride. This film at least had a director and a star, but after the failure of The Mummy, it was put on hold indefinitely. Other films with actual titles include Dark Army and Monster Mash, but both of those literally have no information about them, and their inclusion in the Dark Universe is dubious at best. Monster Mash is supposedly an animated musical comedy directed at kids and thus was likely never intended to be Dark Universe, and the Dark Army really has no information about it at all. There's also an Invisible Woman film, a reboot of 1940's The Invisible Woman, which is, and I'm not making this up, wholly and entirely unrelated to 2020's The Invisible Man. Great job, guys. Also from these films, a slate of untitled films were said to be / rumored to be in production. These include a Dracula film, a Frankenstein film, a Hunchback of Notre Dame film, a Phantom of the Opera film, a Wolfman film, a Creature from the Black Lagoon film, and a Van Helsing film. Every one of these has a page on the Dark Universe wiki, and they all say, quote, "The film will be released in the United States at an unknown date," which is the sort of unearned confidence I aspire to have. So that's the past, present, and future of the Dark Universe. But before we go, I want to take a look at the last remaining canon of the Dark Universe, the Mummy tie-in media. Following the release of the film, 3 tie-in games were released. The first was a VR experience put on at a special VR location and can't be played anymore. The second game, The Mummy Demastered, is a Metroidvania-style game set during the events of the film. You play as a Prodigium agent during the events of the film, and it's actually really fucking cool. Like, they went so hard on this game for no reason. The pixel art art is surprisingly impressive. Just look at the final boss. His eyes and mouth glow different colors throughout the fight that actually reflect back onto the rest of the hands and face. It's crazy. The game involves tracking down the mummy and loosely follows the events of the film. It's not a perfect one-to-one translation, but it works well enough that large portions of the game can be canon without really causing any issues. One of the most interesting mechanics of the game is the death system. When you die, you don't respawn. Instead, you play as a new character without any of the gear the previous one had. If you make your way back to where you died, you have to fight the zombified corpse of your previous character to get your stuff back. It's a really interesting mechanic that was not at all necessary for a game tie-in to a terrible movie. In fact, none of the effort put into this game was necessary, and honestly, I think the game would have been more successful without the Mummy branding. You can still buy the game for most platforms to this day, and it even saw a 2020 re-release in Japan on the Nintendo Switch 3 years after the movie premiered. Overall, this one is pretty cool. The other game released was The Mummy Dark Universe Stories, an episodic mobile game set after the events of the film, and you can't download it anymore, it's gone. The final piece of canon media in the Dark Universe is a 4-chapter manga series by Ganma called The Mummy Dark Stories, not to be confused with The Mummy Dark Universe Stories. There is barely any record of this existing. I searched for hours and could only find the Japanese version of Chapter 1, but the English translation and even the entirety of Chapters 2 through 4 seem to be lost media. Honestly, the chapter I could find was genuinely pretty cool. From what I can tell, it's about a school field trip to a museum in London during the climax of the film. The main character has this cross necklace with a blade on it, given to him by who I assume is his father. The mummy from the film bursts into the museum on her way to find the stone and resurrects one of the mummies in the museum, which attacks the main characters. The design of the mummy in this is actually really fucking cool, and I love how the wraps look in this design. Also, the design of the revived mummy zombie is also incredibly cool, with half his face being decayed flesh and the other being skeletal. Eventually, the main character stabs the attacking zombie with his knife necklace, which causes it to collapse into a pile of dust. So whoever this guy is, the necklace seems to be some sort of anti-mummy weapon, which is actually kind of cool. Of all the Dark Universe media, I think this is my favorite by far. So to recap, the complete canon media for this universe is a single movie, a 2D Metroidvania, a mobile app you can't play anymore, a VR experience that you can't play anymore, and a manga that has been almost entirely scrubbed from the internet. And that's it. That is the history and legacy of the world's best worst cinematic universe. With about 1 1/4 films to its name and probably none on the way, the future of the Dark Universe seems, well, dark. I really should have just watched Hotel Transylvania and called it a day.